Hi, folks. Welcome back into the Antifragile podcast. With me, as always, is Dr. Adam Wright, co-founder. We've got something a little bit different for you today. We've had on a guest, Corrina Stasik, a former client of mine, who has this really tremendously compelling story that really kind of traverses her childhood, which is for those of the Netflix series Ozarks, is basically a real life kind of lived experience of that show in some ways. She has a terrific podcast detailing that story called My True Crime Life. But in this particular conversation, the three of us, and in particular, she and Adam, who interviews her in this case, talk about her experiences from the standpoint, I think, of, let's call it fixing the bad or resilience, right? Reacting to different traumas that she experienced, but also moving through this process, I think, of healing and eventually into one of sort of proactively steeling herself, developing anti-fragility, which, as you'll hear, she has a deep interest in, and taking sort of I think, a different role and relationship with her trauma, right? With the things that she's sort of been recognizing, processing, healing. So it was a really compelling conversation. I've been a big fan of Corrina's for a long time. She has such an interesting history, but she's done a lot of work to really understand some of the science and coaching applications behind some of the things we've talked about. And so this one's going to be a little different. Yeah, still some science, still some of the research that Adam and I have been trying to deliver, but I think you're going to hear a lot more of it in sort of a lived experience, a lived narrative today. So we hope you enjoy that. And without further ado, here is our conversation with Corrina Stasik.
Hi, Adam. I
Corrina,
don't think we've ever formally met, so nice to meet
We
you.
have not. Nice to meet you. I feel like I know you. I met and listened to a few of your episodes, so I feel like I already I'm familiar.
Oh,
It's always a strange thing when you have somebody. It's so intimate having someone in your ear, right, speaking to you. So when you meet them, you feel like, oh, I know this person already. Yeah.
thank you for listening. That's really surprising. I'm surprised you listened, but it's great.
But I think what struck me was in the beginning of your podcast, you state basically truth is more shocking than fiction. So immediately made me think, okay, well, what motivated this person to share this truth in this public format that really does mirrors the tension of true crime TV? So what's it stemming from?
So the way it started, and I think I alluded to this in the podcast, is the show Ozarks on Netflix was something that was floating in and out of my life during a very pivotal moment. And what was, the power of trauma and memory is very strange. And you
Mhm.
was watching the show, and it was more than just the familiarity of the location and being raised in that area, but there were certain things that triggered my memory. And I knew some things, but I didn't ask a lot of questions, even going into my adulthood with my mother. And as the show started to kind of unravel, I started asking her specific questions, and she had not watched the show.
Mhm.
And I was like, wow, this is eerie. I got chills. And it really didn't come to light altogether until later on when I started the work at the Flow Research Collective where I met Nick. And then I started to dig into my purpose and what gave me life, and really thinking about how I reposition myself and navigate myself in the future and generate that feeling of flow. And I started to learn about adverse childhood experiences, which strangely, all the college I'd been through, everything else, it was all light touch. And when I started to really dig in and read the CDC articles and the research papers, and then connecting the dots of consistently interviewing my mother about our upbringing and what really happened, I realized that all the people I'd known like me were spiraling and lost because they didn't have these dots to connect. And it transformed how I was able to heal by understanding the reality of how adverse child experiences follow you into adulthood and those impacts.
Mhm. Mhm.
It transformed my relationship with my doctors. It transformed my relationship with my therapy, with my, proactive plan of how to rearrange myself in life after all of that.
So from a personal perspective, I can see how that obviously very empowering, right? And the associations that were you connected with the show. But what's interesting to me is then you made a jump, which a lot of people wouldn't jump, and you made it public. So inevitably there's fears and doubts in terms of sharing such raw and personal detail about your history. How'd you make that jump?
I realized that the more that I started to interact and share just educational information about adverse childhood experiences, a lot of
Mhm.
people were reaching out to me behind the scenes of social media and, direct messages and, telling me how inspiring and how hard their lives were. And I realized that, my vulnerability was empowering, not just to myself, but to others. And the more I started to share intimately behind the scenes, I realized that telling this story to eventually transition to the proactive life that I lead now would make more sense. And I think people would find, although it was hard to share the story, I think people would find comfort in knowing that although it's not the same, there are similar parallels or probably experiences that, adults have had in the early childhood that they can connect the dots as to what my experience is and where I'm going. The other part that bothers me, honestly, and it's hard because when you talk about trauma, it triggers people.
Mhm.
But we put so much shame on trauma.
Mhm.
And I think it's part of the challenge of people actually getting to the point of healing. So by being outwardly and brave about this story, I'm hoping that people realize they can shed their own shame and empower themselves. And truthfully, a lot of people since I have put out the podcast have come to me and they have no shame. They're like, I was so ashamed, but can I tell you my story? And the more and they tell me. And then they can go tell a therapist or a coach. And that's where the building blocks of real transformative healing, I think, happens for human beings.
Mhm. Mhm. So I think it's from if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like it gave you agency, number one, right? Joseph Campbell used to say slaying the dragons, right? But it was a public display of your slaying the dragons, I think, which is helpful, right? It's leaning into those fears and doubts. But there's something about connection with others that's healing, right, through this process, right? And I'm just wondering how that public story changed the way you see yourself or this whole as it continues to evolve, right? This isn't stopping. This is an evolving organic process. How does that public face of it, that connection with all these other peoples, how's it changing how you view yourself or even your past experiences?
I think that's a good question. I think how I view myself every day as a work in progress, very
Mhm.
humbly, because even as far as I have come, it's still work,
Mhm.
right? And so I think that, when I came out with the story and I wanted to be public and share it, I had this very strong confidence about where I was going. But through the process of speaking it out loud, hearing other stories, it made me realize and humbled me that, you've done a lot of great work, but there's more work to do. And I think that's the biggest lesson is, and that I can share with others in the community is that a lot of individuals and a lot of social media ads want to pump you up with instant healing or, heal
Mhm.
for good and get rid of your trauma. And quite honestly, what I've learned through the process is this isn't a journey for life. Every day gets better, every day you learn and grow, but to accept that you totally disintegrate this with your experiences is impossible to me. And
Mhm.
so you have to brave that the opportunity of growth, for the long term is the goal, is
Mhm.
the real rich experience. And I think that that's hard for some people to understand that it takes work. And or they, they want to be instantly healed. But there will be other things that happen in life. And so I don't
Mhm.
believe it's just about what's happened in the past, but it's also integrating what happens in the future and
Mhm.
being able to respond to that in a way that is positive, has a stable foundation, so that you don't collapse.
I think it's a good point. Having like just creating the capacity to deal what's going to come, right? In some ways, empty your cup so you could fill it up again and empty it out. So, interestingly, doing some research on intergenerational trauma, which is obviously something you talk a great deal about, and I think, psychologically, scientifically, it's very interesting, right? But I'm interested in terms of like your perspective of it,
Mhm.
um, in terms of just your journey with it, recognizing these patterns and seeing these cycles and how they played out, and like just what's your perspective in terms of living it, and now that you're an informed person who works in it, how does that change your perspective and how you work with your clients?
So living in it, that's the other piece, is that living in it with my mother, my family, one of the most beautiful things that came unexpectedly is the family healing that happened
Mm,
across the process. I had distant cousins. So my mom was from a large family, and it's a very broken family, lots of alcoholism, drug addicts, mental health issues.
mhm,
And there was almost a sense of, there were a lot of people that came forth in my family that we had this togetherness and love and peace that we never had before. And that was striking to me. I didn't expect that part. I was actually expecting to reach out to community, and I actually reached out to my family. And it was pretty beautiful. Um, but I think the other part that's hard is I have children of my own. They're 23 and
mm.
25.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And although I was very different in how I raised my children,
Right.
the aspects of what I experienced still came through.
Hmm.
And, there's sort of this ripple effect that as much as you want to insulate it and stop it, like you just, there's a lot of work, not just for you, but the forward family.
Hmm.
And I think that, honestly, it's frustrating, to know that you've done so much work with your whole professional life and how you raise your children, and to still see that replicate
Hmm.
in aspects, not completely, but just in aspects. And I think the thing that it's also given me personally is the ability to turn to my kids and have an honest conversation about what didn't go well. And
Hmm.
that has been really healing and powerful in my relationship with my children, and how we interact and how then they go and interact with their relationships. It's been pretty special, and it's honestly been transformative in that aspect.
Have they listened to the podcast?
No. Which the thing is, I believe they will.
Okay.
I just believe that they'll do it on their own time. Well, actually, I take that back. My daughter did listen to the first one, and then and she did love it. But I think that this is one of those artifacts that will be left when I'm gone, that they
Hmm.
can.
Sure, it's a legacy.
Yeah.
This is a perfect way, I think, to transition about the idea of therapy. I mean, you mentioned it, alexithymia, right? In terms of like you had some struggles identifying and expressing emotions. Um, so let's talk about that whole process, right? What worked, given your experience, what didn't work in the therapeutic process, and how you came to Vanderkolk, and a lot of the somatic aspects of trauma and healing. So just, I'd like to hear that journey.
Absolutely. So my journey with therapy started in my mid 20s, and I went to a therapist for EMDR.
Hmm.
And at the time, that was almost 20 years ago.
Hmm. Yep.
I didn't really know what EMDR was. I was just told this is a really cool thing that worked with veterans. I think it would work for you. And I remember walking out of that session and just feeling a complete shift in emotion and feeling. Like like I felt an instant shift and realized the benefits. Unfortunately, I didn't continue that therapy. Life got hectic. I was a constant therapy dropout. And I kept trying, and I think it really became evident in my late 30s that I was truly trying to get to therapy because life was getting super hard. My relationships at work were tough. Everything was tough. Like I was constantly just activated in so many ways.
Mhm.
And about the time I started pursuing this therapy, and sort of with my primary care doctors, I ran in. So Stephen Kotler's book, Stealing Fire, came across. So
Hmm.
about 2016. And a lot of people interpret that book in different ways. But one thing I took away from the book, what was really strange, is meditation. And just starting at 1 minute a day. And I didn't believe at the time that my mind could sit for 1 minute or 2 minutes. And I had a 6 month streak where I just said, okay, I'm going to try it. And I tried it for 6 months, didn't miss a day, built from a minute to 10 to 20.
Mhm.
And there was a seismic shift in my thought patterns, the peace that I felt, how I, responded to things. And so I went into my primary care doctor, I went into therapy, I went to see a psychiatrist. And what was strange is that through all those doctors that I saw for many years and kept coming back with different challenges as they stacked a different medication on, although I did feel some relief with medication, it didn't really solve the problem. I wasn't
Mhm.
getting to the problems. And the therapist in response, I don't think really educated me in the process either. And I think that if you fast forward today and look at my relationship with my therapist, it is it's bi-directional where she shares and
Mhm.
educates me and I share and educate her. And I feel like
Mhm.
I'm learning, not only just speaking and letting her, And so it's a growing process. And it wasn't until I actually, take the meditation part,
Mhm.
take,
As I do, as in the middle
yeah,
of doing, Mhm.
pursuing all the doctors. The seismic shift, like the big shift was when I finally got to the Flow Research Collective. And Nick, I'm going to call you out on this for a second. So the first time, so Nick was my coach
Mhm.
at Flow Research Collective. And when he met me, I had about 300 milligram monster in my hand. And like, look at you. You're drinking like 300 milligrams of caffeine. What's wrong? And we had very short, like simple conversations, but there was one thing that on top of going to the Flow Research Collective that was a pivot. And I was living in Northwest California on a farm at the time to take a break.
Mhm.
And I talked about how much I love nature. And he said, you should just start committing to get out and get back into nature and get back into backpacking. And I was like, whatever, sure. That's not going to solve everything that's going on. But then I said, okay, I'm going to do that. Just like I did with the meditation, I'm going to commit myself, even on my lunch break, to go out for 15 minutes, breathe the air, watch the trees. And when I started to have that sort of down regulation, so to speak, an
Mhm.
experience, I was in a place where I could organize my thoughts and listen to what was happening to me, my body, the outward world. And it got really clear how to prioritize all these problems. And I started to do my own, and I think the Flow Research Collective also taught me how to do research because we had to write a magnus opus. So I started
Mhm.
doing the research on ACEs and understanding. And then I was positioned to have enough information to educate myself and walked into a therapist's office, a doctor's office, and have a conversation where I was, you know, being able to what's the word I'm looking for? Advocate for myself
Mhm.
into a way that wasn't me diagnosing myself, but giving them enough understanding of where we're at. And it was a beautiful thing because I was on these SSRIs and I hadn't slept right in 4 years. But in 2020 made it really challenging. And instead of being able to get into a doctor's office, they just kept giving you the prescription, status quo, until we could get out of the pandemic. So when I finally was able to get into a doctor's office, I said, look, I think I really want to know what I'm like without SSRIs. And so between the hiking that therapeutic feeling and then getting off the SSRIs, I realized I felt so much better. Like a haze was lifted from me. And I found out later, I got a genetic test. The SSRIs I was on for 4 years were a bad match for my genetics
Mhm.
and were probably exasperating the experience that I was having. And
Desperate. How is that in terms of, because usually the impact is usually a dual affect, right? Generally kind of gets rid of the bad stuff, but the problem is it also gets rid of some of the good stuff too. So you lose a depth and breadth of emotion, right? Your emotionality changes generally on those things. So how did it impact you?
I felt more depressed. I felt more, I couldn't get out of bed for
Yeah.
many hours. And, no matter how much I had slept, getting out of bed by 9 was hard. And,
Hmm.
there was a lot of interesting challenges and responses I was having. Fast forward, that same genetic test was passed to my mom, who took it to her doctor, and she switched to a better genetic match and saw the same shift.
That's not typical. So how did you advocate for yourself to take that route? Because no psychiatrist that I know of that we refer patients to do any testing like that. Basically, they just write the script and ask a few questions.
I'm going to tell you the truth here.
Maybe in that order. Sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes in that order.
No,
But yeah.
the truth is, when I was really committed to finding the right therapist. So I had all these shifts. I understood ACEs. I'd got organized thoughts. I'd come off the medication. I knew what it felt, and I felt better. I at the time, I decided to go to online therapy.
Oh,
And
curious about that. Yeah.
well, turns out I went to an online therapist that ended up being my in-person therapist. So it was great.
Okay.
But I went to the online therapist and she wasn't the first, the therapist I see now wasn't the first. And they said, well, we want to have you talk to a psychiatrist as well, because that's our treatment plan.
Mhm.
So when I went to the psychiatrist, I was fully armed with enough information. And they kind of immediately, I think the way they do their work is like they diagnose and script.
Mhm.
And I said, I got to tell you, I'm here because this is part of the treatment plan, but I don't want to be on medication. I know I feel better. I want to work towards doing this, naturally. And she said, well, if you won't do that, will you at least do a genetic test? So if I do
Hmm.
prescribe
Mm.
you. And I said, sure. And it was the most eye-opening experience because I think there's like 19 or 20 different antidepressants out there. About 16 or 17 were a bad match for me. So, she said, oh, and this explains a lot. And I still declined the medication and I went back to just therapy only. And I went through at least 3 or 4 therapists before I got to a
Yeah.
place because what happened is I kept coming into these therapy sessions again, kind of like the psychiatrist, they would immediately start diagnosing. There wasn't a lot of time
Sure.
to understand my story. And I had enough information at the point that I knew that the diagnosis and the approach was wrong.
Mm.
So I finally found a therapist who has a former addiction past, who has a former trauma past, amazing person. I hope she hears this.
Right.
Say her name. But she immediately understood. She connected the dots. She had the education and the personal experience that she really said, the root of this is, complex PTSD from adverse childhood experiences. And boy, do you have a lot of them. So we got some
Mhm.
work to do. And that's what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear that. I wanted to work through the cognitive processing and therapeutic approaches to this.
How did you walk away from those other therapists? I think so many people have difficulty given the model, given that pattern. It's often a power down relationship where you fit this diagnostic criteria, then you own it as an identity, right? And then once you're there, it's hard to break away from that because you say, "Am I running away from my problems? This person's right. Maybe I'm wrong." How do you deal with that internal conflict to move on to someone that could fit you and there's a co-creative process there?
So the prior self of 2021, who, went through Flow Research Collective and had all these experiences,
Hmm.
would have just stayed with the person.
Right.
and just eventually quit again.
Mm-hmm.
I think that my own psychoeducation and research put me in a different position to now proactively look at, okay, this is how the system runs, and you need to just work through the system
Yeah.
and not give up. And I don't think, I think that that's what kept me in, is that I was like, I'm going to treat this like dating. I'm going to get out there. I'm going to try, and I'm going to be okay with saying, nope, this isn't the right person. And it was a challenge. Like the
It-
way systemic, like the way it worked with my insurance and declining the person was not easy. There was,
yeah.
but I expected that going in now. And but I knew so much that I was in it to continue. And so I just kept taking the challenge and saying, not the right person.
So who else did you use? So I'm assuming Vanderkolk. Did you use Gabor Mate? Did you use Shapiro? Like who else were you look Borges? Who else were you looking at? Daniel Siegel? Who are the trauma
So
researchers that you got into?
Bessel was somebody I immediately started researching and connecting to. Gabriel Mate was great. I love his work. He does great
He's
work.
an
I love
interesting
how
character.
he's so human. I think
Hmm.
he's so human, and I think that that's the piece I was trying to explain earlier, is the connecting that, layman's human terms in the medical society so that people actually can do something with it.
Well,
So
it's that wounded healer that you love so much in your therapist, right? And he actually was a survivor of the Holocaust. Talk about
right,
intergenerational trauma. Yeah.
right,
So
absolutely.
yeah.
And the so after I did the Flow Research Collective, I had this incredible confidence and curiosity, and I wanted to be a trauma informed coach. So I took
Mm,
8 month certification program with Bessel. So
that must have been interesting.
it was incredible. And I tell everybody it's the best experience I've ever had. The reason why is it wasn't just Bessel. It was about 20 to 25 other therapists and professionals in his network that
Hmm.
lectured and educated us in
Hmm.
different modalities. So I learned about EMDR, I learned about yoga, I learned about meditation, I learned about, theater, it's funny, when I finally learned that theater was a modality to healing, I spent most of my high school in theater.
Intuitively, you were drawn there, right? Yeah.
Right. So I did that 8 month certification program, and I am so glad I did it. I did get to sit in the same room with Bessel and I got to ask him a question. My question was picked out of 300 people, so that was great.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah. And so I think what's interesting about Bessel, and the thing that I love most about him, is his history, because he was early on in the SSRI studies and neuroimaging, and that
Hmm.
intersection with veterans, I really think positioned him to have real context to everything that's happening in, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Did you
Now,
look at Peter Levine?
I have not looked at Peter Levine.
Somatic experiencing, which is another interesting book called Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma. Another interesting take on understanding, not only is this psychological experience, but that physiological holding of the nervous system, all along the same lines of, Bessel's work.
Yes, we did talk about that in the course that I took with Bessel. So that did come through.
Hmm. Hmm.
I actually thought that was very fascinating. I think you could go really deep on that. And
Hmm.
it's something that's, on my mental list to explore
Hmm.
when I have more time, because there's lots of things I'm
Sure.
working on. But I think there's a lot to be, you know, enjoyed there. I think that there's a lot that I'd like to learn more, because, you haven't listened to the finale of the podcast, have you?
No, I listened to first three, maybe.
Yeah. So an interesting thing happened to me. And so when I was 12 years old, under the worst part of my trauma, I got shingles at 12 years old, which is an unusual thing to get. And it was, you do look at the research now, and there's a lot of alignment to, children in distress potentially having that, you know,
Hmm. Hmm.
and um, in this process of telling my story, I got shingles again.
Interesting.
Mhm. What was interesting about it was I was doing fine. And then there was a point where I was not with my partner. I was a little socially isolated and doing the podcast. I don't think it's like just the podcast. I think it was a sum of things that triggered this sort of physical result. Uh,
Sure.
but it was definitely interesting. So that's why I want to look at the somatic piece. I think there's a lot to be learned there and gained.
Out of all of these therapies and all these approaches, which ones do you find, maybe this question is not even useful, which one has helped the most, or is it just an amalgamation of them all?
I think the theme that I have learned through all of this
Uh-huh.
is that, and I learned this in Bessel's class too. We talked a lot about
Hmm.
it, is that the concept of therapy and how it's presented to the world or described to the world is you go in and you talk about your problems.
Hmm.
And that's the most triggering event you could possibly have for somebody who, has trauma, is that you're reliving that experience by sitting and talking about it. So that if you backtrack to me talking about EMDR and how I felt, and you talk about nature and me reconnecting in a sense of peace and calm, I think that's the biggest thing is that when your strategy for therapy and healing needs to be in a place where you can calm your nervous system so that you can get past that point of being able to start talking about the issues and doing the actual work. If you just talk about the issues, get re-triggered, fail out of therapy, walk away, decide to just take the medication, which happens to a lot, you never get to the point where you actually get to do the good stuff, like how to have a great relationship, how to have friendships, how to really take care of yourself, and how to be proactive, which I know you guys talk about and teach, is how do you get proactive for mental health? As many therapists as I've sat and talked to, I never got to that point because it was just so traumatizing talking about the experiences. But by the time I did get into a therapist and I was being proactive for myself, my body was calm, my mind was clean.
Hmm. I think that and Nick and I talked about this before. Whether or not you agree with Stephen, I don't know if you're in a polyvagal theory or if you're familiar with this, if you came across this in your studies, and there are problems with this, and it's very hard to test. But the idea that there's something foundational about creating this ventral vagal state where it's a safe environment to talk about these issues without having a safe environment, have a therapeutic reliance or a connection with another human being, re-traumatizes you, right? Because you're in this heightened state and you're reliving it again and again. It ends up being a self-reinforcing loop. And I think a lot of therapies miss that. And I think it's interesting that you found that on your own, which most people don't have the capacity because I don't think people are told what to expect or how to do this. Yeah. You know what the first thing they said to me, Nick, you'll appreciate this when you get into graduate school, when I got into my doctoral program, what do you call the person who finishes last in this class?
What?
Doctor. Right. And the idea is that there are people that are really good at what they do, and there's some people that just get by. It doesn't mean everyone's the same or cares at the same level or really does understand the research and the application of it. And it's important to be
True.
an advocate. Yeah, an advocate for yourself and to understand these processes. I think that's why a lot of people give up. They give up hope because they just haven't found the right person or the right therapy. So
Right.
kudos to you. Yeah, yeah, to take that upon yourself and have agency to do that because that's tough.
There's two thoughts that come to mind. So
Yeah.
one, the giving up and the advocacy. So, a lot of what we read and hear, social media, news, whatever, it shapes how we think of what therapy is. It shapes this instant healing that,
Hmm.
is all over. And I think that that's those two things, like if you think about the reward system, right? I think work against somebody actually getting through it. The polyvagal theory is one that I adore much. I think it's actually very interesting to me because at the intersection of me being proactive, being a self advocate for my therapy, my healing, in came this human being in my life, my partner now that I've been with for 2.5 years,
Hmm.
who has been a really supportive foundation for reinforcing what I'm doing. I think prior, I had never had an authentic relationship where I could be literally the worst version of myself and say, I know this is bad and I want to own it, and still be loved and supported
Mm.
and, cheered on. And I think that that was actually another big reinforcement, as I had this really authentic friendship and loving partner through this process. I think that played a big factor of feeling
There's
safe.
something about, yeah, that radical acceptance, right? Where people are willing to accept every aspect of yourself, because if it happens externally, then you can embody it and you can start to actually replicate what they're doing. And it's important to find someone or people that can do that for you. It's good.
It seems like, right, hearing your story again, sort of in summary, although I've given our past knew a little bit of it already, that there's this transition. We talked about it a little bit before we press record. This transition, I think, from kind of awareness to healing, if you will. Right? I heard complex PTSD, but I'm also hearing stories of resilience. I'm hearing stories of like post-traumatic growth, and all of that is important to always sort of, I think, identify, bring up, and say, this is a part of a lot of people's process, right? And at some point, you again, you mentioned the word proactive a couple times, I think took a mindset, an attitude, a behavior change that seemed to actively not only steel yourself against future potential difficulties and traumas, but consciously, strategically build up a high quality life and a values aligned one as well. But I want to make sure like I'm seeing that right and receiving that right. And if that's the way you experience, maybe you and Adam can chat about that shift a little more.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, the empowerment came through a lot of different things that happened over time, but it really turned a corner when I started to get aligned with a higher level of thinking, understanding, research, because now I'm looking at facts and I'm not questioning what's wrong with me, what's going on. And I think that's the other key part, is the aligning to values. So
Mhm.
I actually had to go through a journey to figure out, what are my values? Because a lot of me was lost over decades, just kind of responding and doing what everybody else expected me to do or I thought I should do. And I did a complete reset. And I probably was a little deeper than most. I even sat and interviewed my mom and said, Mom, what was I like as, before all this? What was I like at this point? What are the things that stood out? And, I would ask, and I did have a girlfriend who I really trusted that could reflect, some sort of wrongs and rights as well that I didn't have in life. And once I had all that information, I did reorganize the Rubik's Cube to say, this is not how we're going to continue to live. We no
Mm,
longer do these things. We actually find joy and, you know, the hope for a future life here. And
yeah.
this is the next stage. And this is how it ends for me.
Just gonna
Right.
you earlier you mentioned narrative, Adam,
Yeah.
right? And that's I
Hmm.
think that came up again there. Notice the narrative shift is and
Hmm.
value shift is kind of a almost a first step, it sounds like, once we've said, okay, a lot of the healing work is ongoing, but I'm gonna shift a little bit of my attention away from that and more like what am I gonna build?
The other thing I think is interesting here is there's a certain personality type. The way you approach it is based upon your personality. So I don't know you well. I'd like to get to know you better, but the idea is, maybe there's a level of extroversion, here given what you're doing, and or maybe that's just contextual. Maybe you're an introverted person, but you can choose to be extroverted. Like we could have a larger discussion around that, state and trait. But I think what's interesting is there's different ways to go about this based upon the person, right? You interviewed your mother and so forth. But there's one thing that seems to be an ongoing thread, right? Read through all this, and when it comes to post traumatic growth and healing, is that people find meaning and purpose in the events themselves. So how does that play into this growth that you've had?
So I'm glad you asked that. That's a question that's important to me. And the reason why it's important to me is because I think the perspective that people have when I've had, if you listen to my whole story, I've had a lot of really rotten, bad experiences. And, some people would look at that and say, screw this life. Like, screw that, screw it all. I just have a bad shake, whatever. But I think, or like, how unfair is it? You poor thing. I think that where I've made a pivot is, this may sound really dramatic, but I don't know if I would change anything that happened to me, because I think that if it wasn't that, it was going to be something else. Life is inevitably about challenge and change and hard things. And so this is what I got. And this is what I've learned. And this is what I can give back to the community as a result. Like, I'm going to be a part of this world and be involved in a way that takes all these lessons and makes them meaningful.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, that's the agency. We just got off another podcast and we were talked about who we wanted to have dinner with, and one of the philosophers I said was Nietzsche, and he was an existentialist. And one of his quotes that I love, it's called Amor Fati. So it's embrace your fate. There's something about accepting everything that will come or has come and using it, right, to move forward. And that's why here in this, there's a radical acceptance of what happened to you, not wishing it for it to be otherwise. It's kind of like being the fire and wishing for the wind, not being so scared of it, say that's going to fuel you and you're going to get stronger from it. But not everyone is in a position to do that, right? A lot of people are much more vulnerable, much more fragile. If you were to say, okay, with this podcast and touching people, I'd be curious to say, okay, what's the first step for someone who had similar experiences, complex trauma, regardless of source? They're not empowered like you are.
Mm-hmm.
Where do they start?
So it's interesting. Scott Barry Kaufman has his book Transcendence, which actually Dr. Holton introduced to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually gone on and did his intensive self-actualization coaching.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, cracking him up.
Good for you. Yeah, I'd like to hear about it.
Real quick, Corrina, but this is the reader copy of his newest book, which actually has a lot to do with what we're talking about. He's coming back on to Flourish FM at some point, but the whole first section is essentially on a lot of the research around like victim mindsets and things like that. So I think it's something we're all going to dig and will be very pertinent here.
I can't wait to read it. I can't wait for it to get out. Read it all years. But I think one of the things he talks about in his sailboat metaphor is, you have, I think it's safety, security, and connection, right, on the whole. And
it's safety, connection, and esteem.
Esteem, that's right. Thank you. So safety, connection, and esteem. And so safety, I think, is the first step. And I think if you look at my story, I got to safety. I got into nature,
right,
hiking, and I think it's more than just that. I think it's safety financially, and shelter and food, those things. You have to start there, because if you don't feel safe, if you don't have the basic needs, if you feel insecure about those things, well, how could you do anything else? So I really believe that you have to start building out that whole. I think self-esteem is another thing, and I'm glad you corrected me, because that is exactly the point, is that the Flow Research Collective, my early 20s, I wanted to be a play therapist. I've always loved psychology. And now I had built this self-esteem in this community that I'd never had before. I felt, I was very insecure most of my life, and that played out in a lot of my problems. But I started to build this level of self-esteem and confidence about what I was learning and the community I was being involved with. And then, the connection. You can't trade anything out for connection. I truly believe that. And that is something that is hard to do when you have trauma. I think you don't understand how to have relationships. The way that you normally would speak to someone or interact with them is very different than when you have trauma. And so start with safety. Then I think you have to start with one friend, one person that can give you confidence, self-esteem, love, acceptance. And then I think that will build the self-esteem.
Yeah, I think that's it's this idea of like stability and predictability, both in like the physical resources around you, but also the relational resources around you, even if it's just one person. Yeah, makes sense.
I mean, we've not really used that language before, Adam, but it's just something I want to like stamp, like stability and predictability as markers of like homeostasis. Rick
Uh-huh.
Hansen, the green zone, right? And what we're often advocating is to like intentionally engage in things that aren't as stable, aren't
Mhm.
as certain, right? And I think
Mhm.
we're it's always worth mentioning we're doing this kind of dance. And I think part of the takeaway from the conversation today, if I may, is like you got to kind of have the stability and predictability in place before you can thoughtfully, strategically, carefully go about inserting instability and uncertainty and ambiguity. That's very different than having those things just fall upon you without choice or any control over the matter, right?
It- If you go back to some of the earliest research with Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth when they did attachment studies, I don't know if you've
Mm,
read this and came across this. This is like 101 for you out there, right? But if you look at those kids that are really really willing to explore, they were the kids that had the most stable relationships with the mother that allowed them to be less risk adverse. Risk
yeah,
adverse.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it starts with a foundation of safety. Then you can go out and take chances because you know you have something to come back to where you're fully accepted.
That is similar to, I think, the mechanism in the delayed gratification studies, the famous marshmallow
Yeah.
studies, right? You can
Hmm.
actually divide those up somewhat by socioeconomic class. Like
Hmm.
in that case, it wasn't curiosity, it was sort of the discipline. On average, like the kids who were waiting for the second marshmallow were from, let's say, higher socioeconomic classes. They expected a second marshmallow to come. There was an inherent sort of optimism there because of, the security that had been in place for them up to that point. And we'll start to wrap here, Karina, but we'll kind of summarize the conversation for everybody afterwards. So if you want, like I want to give you an opportunity, where can people kind of find out more about you, your story, your work? Certainly we want to mention My True Crime Life, your first podcast, but I don't know if you've officially titled the new podcast that's coming out, but where can people interact with you more?
So first is Instagram, Corrina Stasik. The second is uprisingtogether.com will be the domain, and Uprising will be the new podcast. And
Great.
it will be focused on, sort of transformation and moving forward past trauma. And I think that's where I really want to pivot my focus now that the foundation of my history is out there.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Well, we really appreciate the time. We're looking forward, obviously, to joining you soon on Uprising as well. And thanks for sharing some of your story and perspective with us.
No, thank you for having me. It's an absolute honor to serve the community and to be here and to share my story and to help others learn. So I truly appreciate it. Thank you.